If everyone can please find their seats, we'll get started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Nellie Szilagyi-Benedek, Deputy Director for Education and Programs at the Jewish Museum. I'm pleased to welcome you to our fourth and last Director's Talk of the season, in which our director, James Snyder, is in conversation with notable figures around issues relating to this complex moment in time. Our next series of talks will begin in the fall, and if you would like to be added to our mailing list, you can sign up for our e-news by visiting our website, or you can sign up at the list near the door. The Director's Talks are part of the Morris W. Offit Lecture Series made possible by the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation. And we would also like to thank the Singer Foundation for their support of our post-October 7th action plan, of which our Director's Talk series is a central component. We are extremely grateful. The aim with this series is to share ideas and engage with issues through a cultural lens, to consider the perspective of artists, writers, and other creatives. Our guest tonight is Tarek Masoud. Tarek Masoud is the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Governance at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He serves as the faculty chair of the Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative and the Initiative on Democracy in Hard Places. His research focuses on political development in Arabic-speaking and Muslim-majority countries. He has published extensively about Islamic culture, the Arab Spring, and democracy in challenging places. He is a 2009 Carnegie Scholar and a trustee of the American University in Cairo, and holds an AB from Brown and a PhD from Yale, both in political science. We are all looking forward to the conversation tonight and appreciate your being here with us. I would like to remind everyone that this is a space for civil discourse and mutual respect, and we are here to listen to our speakers. To that end, please turn off your cell phones and refrain from recording or photographing during tonight's program. And now, join me in welcoming our speakers, James Snyder and Tarek Masoud. Thank you.
Good evening to all of you. You know, I'm still new here, but this series has become like Old Home Week. It's so many of you have been coming throughout the series, and many of you we know. And it's really nice to be here together with you. And as Nellie walks to her seat, as I do at every one of these talks, I really have to ask all of us to acknowledge her for shepherding this series. These are such complicated times, and to do something like this, where really we do pack the house. Tarek from the Kennedy School said, oh, maybe 175 said yes, but we know from the Kennedy School only 50 or so show up. And I told him we'd be a packed house. Tarek, look out there.
You're always right. Yeah.
Anyway, it's great to be here with you. As Nellie said, this is the fourth in our series. It's the last for the spring. We will be continuing in the fall. And as Nellie said, we wanted to use this series as an opportunity to talk in a public setting within the museum about the complexity of these times, and not to do politics, to talk to artists, writers, creative makers of all kinds. Those of you who have been coming to the series know that we started with Ruby Namdar, an Israeli-born fiction and nonfiction writer of Persian heritage, then Zoya Cherkassky, a Soviet-born emigre to Israel, whose art is really about depicting the experience of outsiders in Israel, and I hope all of you were able to see the drawings that we showed of her series about October 7, which was really also a very gratifying moment for us, given the way that the installation of her drawings really was embraced in an appropriate way by all of our audiences. And then Michal Rovner last month, being perhaps the most internationally recognized Israeli artist who has a deep-seated Israeli heritage, but whose vocabulary of images about memory and global migration resonate just not in the Middle East, but also around the world. So tonight is special in a way. We're stepping beyond our cultural landscape. We are entering the academic world, and of course, doing so just now couldn't be more timely given the resonant roles that museums and universities have in these complex times. We are meant to be platforms for education and engagement. As we all know from these last several months in our art and museum worlds, and in more recent time in the academic world, we have also become lightning rods for protest. So museums and universities really are addressing these challenges in the same time and in different ways. This will be part of our conversation, and this is why it's especially appropriate to have Tarek Masoud here with us. I am in a moment going to ask him to tell us his story from day one, because it's important. In these times, we all know this, and later we're going to talk about it in relation to the Venice Biennale, which is going to be our last sort of topic, but this notion of where you're from and where you are today. But first, I want to tell our story about how we came to know each other, not so long ago, but in a way long ago. It was the summer of 2018. Harvard had created an Israel immersion trip for Harvard deans, and Tarek was a central part of organizing that trip. They concluded their several days in Israel by coming to the Israel Museum and having a tour of the Israel Museum. You all know the Israel Museum, it's dear to my heart. And what is the mandate of that place? It's about demonstrating over 1.5 million years the narrative of material cultural history across the global landscape. We did our tour. You know, I arrived, it was a Saturday morning, and they all looked a little cranky. I'm not sure what had happened during the week, but we spent 90 minutes having that experience, looking at how all things connect across time and place. Afterward, we had lunch with David Grossman. Many of you know him and his work as a writer, and his signature really is about being a deep-rooted Israeli writer whose preoccupations are both local and universal. Afterward, Tarek went home. Actually, Tarek parked my car. We went to Abu Ghosh for our lunch with David Grossman. It was a magnificent day, bougainvillea everywhere outside. The conversation was incredible. Parking was impossible. So I was driving our 1995 Midnight Blue Volvo 940 station wagon, and there was no way I was going to be able to back up to park on the sidewalk, and Tarek did it for me. Somehow, when he got home to Cambridge, he wrote me a beautiful letter inviting me to become a senior fellow in the Middle East Initiative at the Kennedy School so as to bring culture to the syllabus of the school. Since then, I call him my brother from another diaspora. So, Tarek, why do I say all of this? So
I don't know.
He's going to tell you his story. He is an Egyptian Muslim, but he was born in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He was really educated here in the U.S., and today he is anchored deeply in Cambridge, Mass., but his focus is the Middle East. So, your story.
Oh, God. Well, first of all, can I just say, James, you are just an extraordinary person. Thank you for welcoming me to this beautiful space and for that very warm introduction. I'm so dazzled by what you said that I've forgotten my story. I think my life begins when I met James Snyder. And in James's typical overly generous fashion, he had me being one of the organizers of this trip to Israel. In fact, I wasn't. I was just one of the people who was lucky enough to be invited to attend, but it was a very formative experience for me, and in no small part because that's when I met James Snyder and got to drive his car. So, I also just want to recognize that, we are obviously, it's very hard to be in James Snyder's presence and not be entirely joyful and infected by his spirit of wonder and just effervescence. But of course, we recognize that we are talking at a time, and you noted this, James, of great challenge and pain in our world. I have never had therapy, although many people tell me I need therapy. But there's a little line I have sort of internalized through osmosis that apparently therapists say, or people who are therapeutically inclined say, which is, hurt people hurt people. And I feel that what we're observing now on our campuses, where there's a feeling of tremendous mutual recrimination, insensitivity by people who really should know better to the feelings of others, it really does testify, first and foremost to me, of just the incredible hurt that is very evenly distributed, unfortunately, in our communities. We have our Jewish students feeling tremendous hurt. You have Palestinian students feeling tremendous hurt. And I yearn for a day in which we can have a day of healing. And I think you, James, are and have always been an agent of healing. So thank you. My story is not that interesting. I'm an academic. That line that people say, those who can do, those who can't teach, okay? I am one of those who can't. So I teach, and by the way, I can't really teach very well, if you at least read my student evaluations. But I, as James said, the basic contours of my story are such that, I was born in the United States to Egyptian immigrant parents, and I lived here until I was 9 years old. I'm one of 5 brothers. And then I spent my formative years actually in Saudi Arabia. That's really where I grew up. And I went to the old Saudi Arabia, not the shiny new Saudi Arabia where women get to do things like drive cars. And I then came back here to the United States when I was about 17 years old for high school and college, and I worked in journalism for a few years before my mother said to me, look, I sent you to America to become a doctor, and you said you'd become a doctor. And that's clearly not happening. But I need to be able to call you doctor somehow. So figure it out. And I, at the time, was working for a gentleman, actually on 68th and Park. I was working at Foreign Affairs magazine. And I worked for a gentleman named Fareed Zakaria. And Fareed had a PhD in political science from Harvard. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna do that. And so I didn't even apply to Harvard because I thought Harvard is only where geniuses go. And I never thought I never applied to Harvard for undergrad. I didn't apply for grad school. The most I did with grad school is I applied to Yale, and I didn't think I'd get in. I got in. And so I did my doctorate in political science at Yale, and then and I wrote about democracy in the Arab world and religion. And basically, at the time when I was writing, the great obsession of people who were thinking about the Arab world was these very hyper-religious, like you might say, ultra-Orthodox Islamic parties. They seem to be the most vibrant and energetic and popular political parties. Why is that? And so I wrote my dissertation, ultimately my first book about that. And then anyways, I was finishing up, and there was a job opening at Harvard, and my advisor says to me, hey, there's a job opening at Harvard. You should apply for this job. I said, well, Harvard is like, that's a place for geniuses, and I'm not a genius. And she said, oh, you're definitely not a genius, but you should apply for that job. And then I applied for the job, and I got it, and I showed up at Harvard, and I realized, like, oh, there are actually very few geniuses at Harvard. So, as James said, I met him in the summer of 2018. And that was only my second trip, actually, to Israel. The first time I'd gone to Israel was in 2009 or 2010. I can't remember. And, if you are an academic who works on the Middle East in general, the Israel-Palestinian issue is a very tense issue, and so I didn't really want to try to talk about it or even touch it because I thought I might get burned. And so I went on one trip, and then I really just avoided it for a number of years. I taught a class on Middle Eastern politics. And in order to avoid any kind of classroom blowups, I used to put my Israel-Palestine discussion at the very end of the class, because I'm always chronically late and behind on my syllabi. So by the time we get to the end of the class, we don't have time to do Israel. I was like, oh, sorry, guys. But it's only then when when I was invited to come on this trip, I said, I'm going to go and do it. And of course, I got a little bit of grief for it. But frankly, it was very eye-opening. And you really, James, by meeting you and realizing that we really do share not just a lot of Semitic DNA, but a general orientation, a similar orientation to the world of ideas and the need to have really searching and open cross-cultural encounters in order to achieve a day of understanding. That's what caused me to reach out to you and try to yoke you to my program permanently, and I'm glad you said yes.
This is really interesting because I do recall I had been away the week of that trip, and I arrived back just in time to meet the group at the entrance to the Israel Museum on a beautiful Saturday morning. And I had anticipated that everyone would look very happy. But everyone looked really cranky. There was something. There just seemed to have been a contentiousness throughout the week of the trip. And a lot of the visit really had to do with the political side of the landscape. And all the conversations were contentious. And as I said, we spent 90 minutes in that magnificent setting on that magnificent landscape, absorbing how all things connect over 1.5 million years. And by the time we finished our walk through, there really was an incredible sense of engagement among everyone present. And our lunch with David Grossman was just one of the most extraordinary ever. And the funny thing is, before you finished your description and I recalled that moment, I was going to have my next question be what I'm about to ask you, but it's even more relevant, which is because your story at Harvard is so connected to politics, political history in the region, what was it that stimulated you to write to me to say that you wanted to add culture to the syllabus at the Kennedy School?
James, I think, when we met you, the group actually, this was a group of Harvard deans and a couple of faculty. And James is absolutely right that by the time we met him at the Israel Museum, there was no contention among us, but there was definitely a heaviness. Because, look, to be frank, it's hard to engage with this place and not be weighed down by the difficulty of all of the issues, right? Part of the tragic thing about this place, everybody makes a good argument to you. Everybody has a good argument, and you are trying to be Solomonic and neutral and analytical and adjudicate among all of these arguments, and it's very hard to do. And so when James Snyder showed up, we're in the Israel Museum, which is this tremendously inspiring place, because it reminds us, first and foremost, we are all connected, okay? And we are all part of a human story. And so, when you're in the Israel Museum and you're seeing the Dead Sea Scrolls and you're seeing a Picasso and then you're seeing some some ancient Islamic art and then some very ancient artifacts, it's very easy to realize how insignificant all of or it makes the kinds of discussions we have at the Kennedy School, which are about where should we put the border and who should be responsible for policing this checkpoint. It makes it all seem so small. And so that was part of it. It caused me to realize that, wow, if people could connect to culture and that would help us to understand our common humanity and maybe give us a broadened perspective, maybe even a spirit of generosity, a sense of we feeling that might make problems easier to solve. The other thing, frankly, and this is a kind of core belief of mine, is that we should disagree. okay? I'm a product of, American educational institutions that, at least in my day when I was getting educated, I don't know how they are now. I mean, I do know how they are now because I work in one. Spoiler alert, it isn't this way anymore. But they were founded on vigorous but cheerful argument. And, argument, very important, but the cheerfulness and the respect for your opponent as a person was was also something I was taught was essential. And you, James, just exude this kind of cheerfulness, this sociability, you start from the recognition that we are all brothers and sisters. When I first met James, very quickly he started calling me a brother from another diaspora. And I was like, oh my God, James Snyder thinks of me as his brother. And then I saw James calls this guy his brother. And I was like, how special is this? But then I realized it's even more special because he's teaching us something about all of us and the way that all of us are connected to each other. So my initial thought, and then I'm gonna be quiet because I know I'm prolix. But my initial thought about wanting to bring culture into the curriculum of the Kennedy School as it relates to the Middle East was this, that maybe we can insert some of this, James Snyder outlook into people, and that will broaden perspectives and create opportunities. I have since developed, and because, James is an optimist, I'm very pessimistic. What's the line, Shimon Peres's line, that optimists and pessimists all die the same, but they live very different lives. So I'm definitely, the way, I see the darker side of human nature, etc. And so in addition to this uplifting reason for wanting to insert culture into our curriculum, I also think it's important because, my students are ultimately people who are going to sit across negotiating tables and make, policy, etc. And they have to understand the stories that the people with whom they are working tell about themselves. How do people tell stories about themselves? They tell the stories about themselves through their art, through their music, right? So if you were to, look at Palestinian, art, it's all about dignity, right? There is a lot of, clearly there's a sense of hurt and shame in that community. And then if you look at art like Zoya Cherkassky's art about October 7th, you see the horror of what happened on October 7th and the fear and the resolve that not happen again. And so by understanding each other's art, we can understand each other's story. And sometimes that art tells stories that we think are wrong, right? Like, that's not an accurate story that your art is telling. But my view is that we need to understand the story that the other side is telling about themselves and to future generations not yet born, in order to have a hope of trying to untie some of these knots.
You're making this really easy because you raise all of these points in such resonant ways. And listening to Tarek talk about their week in Israel before we met on that Saturday morning, it occurs to me, if we'd been in town and if we had taken you around Israel and all around Jerusalem, you would have seen a different country. Because if you look at all of that complexity from a cultural perspective rather than a political one, it's much easier to have empathy. It's much easier to be compassionate. And, I start every talk by asking whoever I'm talking to tell a story so that we know where you're from, because what you look like now may or may not relate to where you started. But where you started is deep in here. And that is the challenge that we are all finding today. Because look, the world is migrating now. As I said, at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about this Venice Biennale, which is, the title is Foreigners Everywhere, and it's this notion of starting somewhere, but being somewhere else, and flowering in your personality, in the way you are and who you are, really has to connect from the start to the finish. So, as those of you who know me know that in my Israel Museum years, it was really all about cultures wandering in the global diaspora and resonating with one another. And in the 6 months that I've been here, and with what's happened during that time, after October 7, I realized that we here are about and need to be about the Jewish diaspora, wandering for 3,500 years across the global landscape, resonating with cultures around us, being influenced by them. And we realize here in the museum that not just our role in the Jewish Museum, but the role of museums everywhere today is to lead the way, to show that cultural activism and cultural engagement can be an antidote to the xenophobia and the political polarization that we are all seeing all around us. And Tarek, our conviction is to understand that as our mandate now. Do you see that academia is in a position to do the same, to embrace the same responsibility, to feel that it has the same role?
I think certainly academic institutions should embrace that role. I mean, obviously, we're having this conversation at a moment where probably everybody in the audience has seen on their Twitter feeds or social media feeds evidence of universities not necessarily being places for the repairing of those breaches or for the fostering of that kind of understanding. And, the reasons for that are incredibly complex. But I think that the university, even though today may be falling short or may still be trying to find its way in this particular moment towards that very noble goal that you talked about, it's still, along with the museum and other cultural institutions, still is the human organization that has the greatest potential, I think, to help us to stitch together our common humanity, to overcome xenophobia, to overcome nationalism and feelings of exclusivity, etc. So, but we're now in a moment where that isn't quite happening, and again, we could get into why that isn't happening, but it's why it's all the more important for those of us who are driven by this deep commitment. And we might ask ourselves, where does a guy like Tarek Masoud and James Snyder, where do they get this kind of common commitment from? And it could be, some, genetic inheritance from our common ancestor 5,000 years ago. But I think it's also a product of the institutions in which we were educated. I mean, I'm maybe 2 or 3 years younger than you, and that's a joke. Unless I look that old. No, I'm just kidding. But I think,
I look that young.
You look extremely young. But, you and I both have talked about how, your experience in school was actually not that different from my experience going to, your experience at school in rural Pennsylvania was not different from my experience in high school in rural New Hampshire. And part of what I think characterized both of our experiences was this belief in this country as a place of many different people who nonetheless were one. Out of many, one. And that's corny, and today we don't talk about that, and we say, out of many, many, and let's find more of the many and the many. But I think we come from an era where we were trying to we're trying to make something bigger. And so I think that's what I bring to my job and you bring to yours.
Tarek, you say that you're not a pathological optimist, but you just now sounded like a pathological optimist.
Well, hang out with James Snyder long enough. And
So, before October 7 happened, we had an idea this past fall to do a course on art and politics, politics and art. And you don't put those things together unless your idea is to look at ways in which art across art history resonates with politics by responding to the politics of its time or creating languages that get embraced by the politics of its time. And that was our idea, and of course, October 7 changed that, and that's not going to happen yet. Hopefully, it's going to happen next year. But it brings me to what I want to talk about next, which is how in the Middle East you look at all of this from biblical times to the present, and how if you really start with the Bible, it's like the Bible is a metaphor for reality. You can choose to look at the Bible in many different ways. You can look at it as the manual for your belief system. You can look at it as literature. And you can also look at just as a metaphor resonating with the times in which it was created. So I want to go back to like square one, and we often say that we are Isaac and Ishmael. And how come we're Isaac and Ishmael?
Well, I mean, this is the Jewish and the Arab people are, historically thought to be the descendants of Abraham. And Abraham had, his son Ishmael I'm a Muslim. I'm in an audience that I'm assuming is majority Jewish. So
Make no assumptions.
I'm going to tell you the way I was taught this. But if I'm making any errors, don't be upset with me. It's just my Islamic Sunday school education. We're told Abraham had his wife Sarah, who in the Quranic retelling of this story could not have children, and he had a maid servant named Hagar. And Sarah said to him, well, you should, please feel free to reproduce with Hagar. And so Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, or Ismail, as we say in Arabic. And then Sarah gave birth to Isaac. And Isaac is the father of the Jewish people, and Ishmael is the father of the Arab people. And the line, this I do know from the biblical text, the line in the Bible about Ishmael, what is it? He will be like a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be raised against every man, and every man's hand will be raised against him, like always fighting. I was like, that's a pretty good description of me. I love to argue. But I think we use the metaphor, or we use the reference, because we're trying to call to the essential brotherhood of these two peoples who are today very tragically in conflict. But I think by pointing to the brotherhood, by pointing to the common roots, we also are gesturing vaguely at a future where they can once again not just be brothers, but behave like brothers.
Again, you're making it so easy this evening. Because you're taking us where we want to go and where we need to go. Those narratives are unbelievably intertwined, and politics doesn't give you the same opportunity to explore and understand how they are intertwined in the same way that the Bible does, and that art and culture does over time. So, Passover was not so long ago, and this gives us a chance to talk about the story of the Exodus. I mean, this is like a great, amazing story for all of us. And for me, it's this point about the Bible and biblical metaphor. The time of the Exodus, it's a story that's been told many times over. The Exodus was actually a metaphor for a period of time where there was an ecological and political reality which was related to, do you remember a show that we did in 2015 at the Israel Museum called Pharaoh in Canaan? It might have been the best archaeology exhibition ever done, and it was about how during that period of time the Canaanites were in Egypt because of global warming, because of a drought. And there was political weakness because there was ecological disaster, which caused weakness in a pervasive way. And they were there for a really long time. Over time, the strength of the region was restored. Nationalism and xenophobia arose, and those Canaanites were pushed back by the Egyptians. yet another example of regional migration or global migration. They were pushed back to what would become the ancient land of Israel, but they weren't just pushed back. For 500 years, Egypt ruled in what would become the ancient land of Israel. Akhenaten was one of the pharaohs in that period. He had this great idea or crazy idea, not to worship many gods, but to worship one force, the sun. And of course, they got rid of him very quickly. But this notion of monotheism was born then. And, finally, those Egyptians went back, and that exhibition was all about this 500-year period, which is demonstrated today by Egyptian archaeology that resonates with biblical archaeology from the same period of time. And, it was ecology in that time that kind of forced this move in one direction and then back into another. So there are many repeats of that story, and what we're experiencing today is about that as well. And, if we've talked about this a lot, if you forget about countries, if you stop talking about countries and nationalist identities, and you talk about cultures, and you think about that 500-year period where monotheism got born because of an Egyptian sentiment of a moment that got embraced by those Canaanite people who sooner or later created the monotheism that would make Judaism. So the question is, can we think about how that today might be a beneficial reflection?
Wow. Okay. That was extraordinary. I mean, your retelling of the Passover story and we've talked a little bit about this, but I hadn't really. I'm not as familiar with you with the sort of what the archaeologists have uncovered about that. In the Quran, we're told God created you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Okay. And I think that is a very important idea, and it's, I think, one that probably you could find in the Jewish tradition as well. Look, I mean, your point about country. If we could just get past countries and just think about ourselves as cultures, that is a beautiful idea. It's not necessarily a recipe for ending conflict. So think about the story I just told you about Isaac and Ishmael. I skipped over one fact, okay? What we're taught as Muslims is that when Abraham was told by God to sacrifice his son, the Muslim story is that he took Ishmael. It's the same story, but it's like Ishmael. It wasn't Isaac, it was our father, okay? And so there's always things to argue about. And because ultimately, I mean, think about it. You have children. I have two boys. They argue about, who does dad love more, And, so brothers also have things to argue about. So my view is that, culture is helps us, or an attention to culture helps us solve these problems. But the problems, but we have to ultimately solve the problems. So in other words, people live in countries. They are attached to land. They need to be able to live safely, as the people of Israel will say, and the Palestinians will say. They need to be able to determine their own future, again, in the physical plane, okay? And so ultimately, they're going to have to talk about borders. They're going to have to talk about security arrangements. They're going to have to talk about those things. They're not going to give up their attachments to those things. So, but I think you and I would be very happy to live, in, say, the old Ottoman Empire, where you could be a Jew in Jerusalem and a Muslim in Jerusalem and be buddies, etc. But unfortunately, this is yet another way in which you and I are anachronistic. But today, people really do feel very rooted to nation states. And so, short of remaking the entire organizing principle of the present world, how can culture help us to achieve peace between these nation states or peoples, etc.? And that's where I keep coming back to, again, helping us understand the stories that people tell about themselves so that we can deal with each other with empathy. I sometimes think how much easier. I mean, the problems in Israel, Palestine are very thorny problems. Ultimately, they are very difficult ones to solve. But how much easier would they be to solve if each side recognized or acknowledged the other side's pain, the validity of the other side's story? And that can allow us to come to the table as equals and then make the difficult decisions about where to put a border and how to make a security arrangement.
Again, it's a good point. And it does also speak to this notion of your story and your personal cultural heritage, because cultural heritages can resonate much more easily than the political narratives that come out of situations like the one we're at the moment. And I want to sort of fast forward to not today, we're going to get to today, but do you remember those Abraham Accords? Not so long ago, there were the Abraham Accords, and there seemed to be movement forward because it was meant to be a socioeconomic pathway initially that could lead to cultural engagement. And you remember, right before October 7, Bibi Netanyahu talked about how Saudi Arabia was going to enter that picture, and it would have made an enormous change. Now, in your setting, which is about politics and political history, what was the assessment of all of that? Where did you all feel? Forget October 7, go right before it, when this announcement was made that there might be now a true bridge to opening ties between Israel and the entire Arabian Gulf.
No, I think, for many of us, this was this was a momentous development. There was no reason for the United Arab Emirates to not have a normal diplomatic relationship with the State of Israel. There isn't a reason for Bahrain or Morocco to not have a normal diplomatic relationship with the State of Israel. And it's my conviction that the more these relationships become normal and routine, ultimately the better it will be for the people of Israel, but the better it will also be for the Palestinian people. In that there will, because Israel will no longer see itself as a place surrounded by enemies, but as a country embedded in a region with lots of friends in the region. What can you do with what do your friends tell you? Your friends say, hey, why don't you make a concession here? Don't worry. I mean, it might make it, in Israel that is feeling much more welcome in this part of the world and that has many more friendships in this part of the world, might be an Israel that is able to make some of the difficult concessions that Israel will have to make ultimately. I don't think we're in that moment today, but ultimately, so that the Palestinian people can achieve their desire for self-determination. The difficulty that the Abraham Accords brought was that it didn't create an equivalent feeling of confidence on the part of Palestinians. And I think this was in part because it was not appropriately described, in part by the countries that undertook it. So Palestinians, many Palestinians felt that the Abraham Accords constituted an abandonment of the Palestinian issue by the other Arab countries. And as opposed to, the other Arab countries continuing to want to see Palestinian self-determination, but also not feeling that a perpetual state of war with Israel and every state in the region was the right way to get there. So I do think there was a missed opportunity there, because ultimately I do think that peaceful relationships between Israel and its Arab neighbors will ultimately redound to the benefit of the Palestinian people. But this was a difficult. It was not. I think the potential for it was untapped, and now, of course, we're in this moment, post October 7th, where the horror at that event and the fury is still so present that, you know, I think we are quite a ways away from the peace that those people in both of these countries deserve.
And you know, you're right, and we're on hold on that front. But I do remember, and Tina remembers as well, we arrived in Israel a few years before the Second Intifada, and in the Israel Museum, we were doing exhibitions of emerging contemporary art from Israel, Jordan, Egypt. All these artists were together. They would come, they would be engaged. It was about sharing stories, it was about sharing heritage, and it was about compassion and understanding among the parties. And when the Abraham Accords started to get underway, there were examples of cultural interchange with the countries that first signed on with the Abraham Accords. So maybe it's just that we have to put that on hold for a little bit and clearly get past the moment that we're in.
Yeah. Can I just add something on this, James? Because I think this point is so important. You know, I think the Abraham Accords were remarkable. I often have to defend that position among, you know, many of my professional colleagues who, again, view the Abraham Accords as a distraction, as a sidelining from the main issue, which is the Palestinian issue, et cetera, et cetera. But I really do think that it creates opportunities and possibilities for peace. But at the end of the day, I do always say to my Israeli friends, you know, my ancestral country is Egypt, okay? Egypt made peace with Israel now, you know, more than 45 years ago. And ultimately, that's great. That was good for Egypt, and it was good for Israel. But it didn't, the main problem, the main challenge, the main difficulty that is faced in Israel is in their relationship with the Palestinians and trying to achieve a political separation from the Palestinians so that the Palestinians can develop on their trajectory and the Israelis can develop on their trajectory. So I always say there is no getting around that conversation, that encounter where the people, the leaders of Israel and the leaders of the Palestinian people have to sit down across a table from each other and they have to hammer things out. And what I hope is that when they sit down and do that, they do that with the memory of Isaac and Ishmael and our common father Abraham.
And that's actually where, just to bring it to this point, that's where universities and museums at the moment can play a hugely important role. You know, after October 7, you all know because you're all on our mailing list, we did announce an action plan thereafter, staff workshops, talks like these, opportunities for artists like Zoya Cherkassky to show in our galleries. So we expressed a commitment to engagement, to an openness to trying to puzzle through the complexity of the moment. And it is proven out, and I shouldn't say this, but you've all seen how in these recent months, museums have been a lightning rod for protest. We haven't had it here the way that they've had it at other museums, and maybe in part it's because we've created platforms like this where we're not asking what everyone's particular point of view is, politically or otherwise, but we're offering opportunities to listen, to hear, and to be engaged. So we have a little bit of a way to do it on our end. Do you feel that in a university setting, in your own setting at Harvard, can you see an opportunity to accomplish that?
You know, I mean, so I teach at a graduate institute of public affairs. And so, you know, there's an argument to be made that if I never have anybody angry at me or there are no protesters who want to disrupt my events, I'm not doing the right thing or I'm not focusing on what's important. So my view is that in the university, what we really need to develop is our capacity for engaging with arguments with which we disagree intensely, but responding to those arguments with counter-arguments in an atmosphere of civility in which we abide by the rules of discourse. Me sitting across the table from somebody with whom I don't agree does not mean that I am secretly endorsing that person or choosing to quote-unquote platform them, which is a term that our students use whenever I have an encounter with somebody that they don't like. This is what we have to do. The human experience, human progress is made when people who disagree with each other sit down and figure out what they can agree on. And so I think my task at the university is a little bit different. So than say your task. But ultimately, we are, I think, driving towards this same goal. You are trying to remind us of our common humanity. I am trying to do that too, but which is why I took some of James Snyder's time. But I'm also trying to get people to sharpen their arguments. Anytime I go to a meeting and, I'll see Israelis and Palestinians or whatever, put in any two groups that are not in agreement with each other, and side A says something vague, and side B says something vague. I said, no, come on, can we just sharpen this disagreement here? What's the Yiddish term? Let's talk tachlis, right? Can we just get to the point here? You tell me exactly what your position is. You tell him what your position is, and maybe we can from then start to. So that's also an important function, but I want it to be supplemented by some of the magic of James Snyder, which creates the togetherness and and then thinking more macro, the magic of cultural institutions like museums, which again create this recognition of our common humanity.
It's funny. I hadn't used that French word tachlis in a long time, and I used it this morning, exactly to describe what you just described. Now, really, just two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up, after which the two of us will be lingering in the front if you want to come and ask us anything. But I said I was going to talk about the Venice Biennale this year for a moment, and really, you all have to get there. It is flawed. It's not a great Biennale, but its theme is foreigners everywhere, and this notion about being from somewhere, but making art today because of where you are today. And it doesn't really play out in the way that it should, but there are some incredible examples of success. And you may or may not know the story of the Israel Pavilion, but I'll remind you, there was a real move. To demand that the Israel Pavilion be shut down and not be part of this year's Biennale, and that didn't happen. The boycott movement tried. The Italian government and Ministry of Culture said, nothing doing, it's going to be there. And they really moved ahead, and they did consult with us, and we said, keep your head down and do a brilliant pavilion. And they have done a brilliant pavilion, but the day that the Biennale opened, the pavilion itself, the artist and the curator, decided not to open. They took ownership of the moment. They created their exhibition. You can look through the window and see it, but on the window it says, we have decided to remain closed until there is peace and until hostages are returned, at which time we welcome you to see the exhibition. And some said, why would they do that? The answer is they took ownership of the story. And if they hadn't done it, the protests outside would have been horrific. There would have been incidents of violence that would have been horrific, and they would have been closed, but instead they took ownership. And this is something that's really quite remarkable, and it really is a perfect example of what cultural activism can be about and how you can deliver a message through that kind of activism. The reason you need to go, and you don't have to stay too long, you just have to make a point of seeing the Israel Pavilion if it opens, and seeing the nearby Egypt Pavilion. These two, actually, I'm hoping that the artists of each of those pavilions will be speakers in our series in the fall. They're both fantastic. Their sentiments resonate in incredible ways. Their work resonates in incredible ways. It's worth going there just to experience what they've done, which really, for each of them, is about signaling the value of cultural activism and cultural diplomacy as a way to a different future. I really recommend it. Tarek's going to come. We might take a trip in September, and Tarek will join us. But Tarek, my last question for you is, hopefully we're going to get past the complexity, the intensity, not the complexity, the intensity of this particular moment at some time soon. So next fall, what course do you think the two of us should teach together that would be about engagement rather than banging your head against the locked door of politics and political polarization?
That's a great question. I would teach anything with you, but more than that, I'd take any course that you taught. I think you'd be an incredible teacher of our students. Look, I think, again, I'm not as imaginative as you are. So when James and I talk about this, I'm always trying to steer us towards how does the art speak to the politics? How can we use the art to understand this political conflict? And James's view is how can we use the art, the culture, to transcend the political conflict? And I do think that tension between us would be very good. I mean, I think we should teach a course in which we pick a set of political situations, a set of whether it's conflicts, whether it's episodes of nation building, political episodes in human history, and then we pick art around it or cultural products around each of these episodes, and then I try to get us to use this art to talk about the conflict, and you try to pull us away. And I think that you and I arguing with each other about that would be very good. Can I just reflect on so he talks about biennales. I'm a peasant. I don't know what these things are. I've never been to one. I never thought I'd be on a stage with somebody talking to me about a biennale. I got to look it up. I thought it was a type of pastry or something. But you mentioned the theme of it, which is foreigners everywhere. And, I can think of some people who would utter a phrase like that, foreigners everywhere, terrible. But, I think of foreigners everywhere in a much warmer sense. Like, what is America, right? America is foreigners from everywhere who came here to become Americans. I often say that I am a product of American educational institutions in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And I feel that, and that is really the heyday, I think, of America. The latter half of the 20th century was really the period in which American educational institutions are unstoppable, unbeatable. And why was that? It was because that was the period where American educational institutions welcomed everybody from everywhere as long as they could hit, as long as they had a brain. They were inclusive and meritocratic in the best sense of the word. And it's been said that even the kind of culture of argument and debate that I thrive in, right, is one that comes out of the Jewish tradition, and that's the Jewish contribution to the greatness of the Harvards and the Yales and the Columbias, because before we had all of these immigrants, those were just places where people spoke to each other in sonorous tones and didn't really have important conversations. And so I really love this theme of foreigners everywhere. I love that this is a country that is built by foreigners who are united by a shared commitment to these United States of America. And so when I call you a brother, it's not just because our DNA tests show that we're both descended from Abraham, but it's also because we're brothers in this American enterprise. Anyways.
Tarek, you couldn't have said that better. 3 points. One, foreigners everywhere. It really is a theme that needs to be puzzled through and realized in a successful way. That's one. Two, teaching is the most admirable profession, so don't belittle your role as a teacher. And three, we will do this course, and you're all welcome to audit it. So we thank all of you for being here. We will be here in the front for a little bit if you want to come and chat.
Thank you, James. Thank you.